Godzilla is probably the most well-known Japanese film of all time. Whether or not you're interested in science fiction or monsters, everyone has at least heard of the giant reptile. Although its reputation was not helped by the 1998 film that was so ill-received that back in Japan, that film's Godzilla was brought into the film Godzilla Final Wars just so they could have the original kick his ass, in a battle so short that the breakable guy from Unbreakable probably could have done better. It was a film that became a symbol of Hollywood cluelessness in adapting a foreign work. The American Godzilla was taking the iconic character and having it attack New York City. The hubris! And yet Godzilla, the real Godzilla, owes its existence because of not one, but two monster attacks on New York City. The origins of Godzilla stretch back in a way to Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes guy, with his story The Lost World, which was adapted into a movie that included Doyle himself, to give you an idea of how long ago we're talking about. The 1925 film was significant because it was the pioneering film for stop-motion animation. The lessons that were learned from this film by Willis O'Brien allowed him to further improve his dinosaur animation and integrating that in with live action. And while his personal film projects failed to see fruition, his special effects so amazed Hollywood and the public that he was able to bring to life one of the most memorable classics of all time, King Kong. Now, while it was a smash hit that led to the sequel Son of Kong, there was a distinct lack of hopping on the bandwagon in the U.S. like you might think there'd be, because O'Brien's work was so incredible, nobody could yet do anything close enough to justify the expense of it. However, the Japanese were happy to shamelessly rip off Kong with two films, which is believed they got around that whole issue of the animation by using an actor in a monster costume against model shots. I say it's believed because the missing episodes issue, that goes beyond the BBC screw-ups infamous with Doctor Who. Both of these Kong films are lost, and so are parts of The Lost World and cut footage from King Kong, including the famous spider pit scene. It might be hard to believe if you're under 30, but there was a time when the only way to see films was in the theater, and I don't mean because the Pirate Bay wasn't around yet. The way they would do it is, it wasn't just new films that were being released. They would re-release old films to be seen, and people would flock to them because, at the time, there was no other way to see them. For instance, I saw Star Wars in 1977, but I wanted to watch it again. I couldn't until 1981, when it was re-released back into the theaters. Between then, there's just no way. Now, obviously, at some point, television began showing film, but in a way, it was the same kind of thing, because if you didn't sit down and watch the broadcast when it happened, then that was it. You were out of luck. Anyway, King Kong was a huge hit, and so it got re-release after re-release after re-release. Finally, in 1952, it had the most successful release that it had ever had. So producers Jack Dietz and Hal E. Chester came up with the idea of combining the giant monster idea of King Kong with the growing fear of atomic power. So they brought a couple of guys on board to work up a script, one of whom was Fred Freiberger, the guy who replaced Gene on Star Trek for Season 3. But they were investing a lot in this bold idea, having brought in Ray Harryhausen, a name that's now synonymous with Hollywood special effects because of his long years of impressive work, and was already known to be a man at the start of a brilliant career, because he had worked under O'Brien on the film Mighty Joe Young, and he was responsible for most of the animation in that film. And the animation was so good, O'Brien actually won the Academy Award. Anyway, Harryhausen was talking with him about the film, and he said, "Maybe you should talk to a friend of mine about this." Well, what's his name? Ray Bradbury. So they approached Ray Bradbury about their movie, Monster from Beneath the Sea. Bradbury looked at it and said, "Hey, this is kind of like my story, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And they said, "Oh, may we buy it? Oh, please, oh, please, oh, please." So The Beast of 20,000 Fathoms was born, the story of a nuclear explosion awakening an enormous dinosaur, which travels the shore, destroying fishing boats and a lighthouse. Mysterious events, but not connected, because the scientist who saw the beast was written off as being diluted by injury and exposure to the Arctic cold. But eventually it arrives in New York City and begins terrorizing the place while the military tries to fight it, ultimately using a radioactive material to kill it without risk of spreading disease. The creature's blood contained a virulent agent, which meant that you risked epidemic if you destroyed the creature in a normal way. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was itself rather, well, unimpressive, at least to me, except for the special effects work, of course. But that's partly because it set in motion the atomic monster era so that other films could build upon that. And there was one person in particular who was inspired by it, Tomoyuki Tanaka, who returned to Toho Studios to pitch a monster movie that was really just Beast that was being redone in Japan. But that was just to get the ball rolling, which of course brings us to Godzilla, which came into being because of three things: World War II, World War II, and World War II. The first being that he had been in Indonesia in the hopes of creating a film to try to mend fences with them, because when Japan had invaded, they were kind of sort of huge dicks to them. But ironically, the film to mend fences couldn't get made because this bitterness was still so fresh that the Japanese crew had their visas yanked by the Indonesian authorities and kicked out of the country. So Tanaka needed to come up with a new project very quickly, and using Beast from 20,000 Fathoms seemed like a good idea. The second World War II connection was the difference between how Japan and America perceived this new genre. In America, while there was fear of the atomic bomb and radiation's effects, in the end, that was because they feared the communists dropping those bombs on them. So the American films often had the monsters as a metaphor for communism. But for Japan, the fear of the bomb was that of a victim of it, having seen and felt it firsthand, knowing what it could do. And remember, this was less than a decade after that happened. So the atomic monster in Godzilla wasn't a metaphor for communism. It was a metaphor for the atomic bomb itself. The third World War II connection was because of Eiji Tsuburaya, Japan's answer to Harryhausen. In fact, because of Godzilla's having swiped a lot of his film and then overshadowing it, Harryhausen allegedly held a grudge against the movie. But Tsuburaya had been an experienced special effects artist. During the war, he was put to work using his special knowledge in order to make propaganda films, including a bombing of Pearl Harbor that was a recreation. It was so meticulously done that it was believed that it was actual footage of the attack. So with films that believable, well, after the war is over, he becomes a special effects powerhouse in Japan, right? Wrong. At that time, propaganda was being considered a Class B war crime. And while that didn't apply to Tsuburaya, the stigma of it hurt his career. He was effectively blacklisted. He had to leave Toho to try to do freelance work just to make a living. So he created his own special effects company. When he was finally able to come back to Toho, he brought the company with him. So when he got to work on Godzilla, he already had an experienced team that had been working on cutting-edge effects in the hopes of, well, trying to make a living out there. And it was exactly what an ambitious film like this needed. While he was a massive fan of the stop-motion work of O'Brien and would have loved to use it on Godzilla, he projected that it would take 7 years to complete the effects that way, which wasn't really an option. The alternative then was to realize the monster the same way they'd done in the King Kong ripoffs, put a man in a suit. Now, we can't compare because, as I said, those films are now lost to us. But regardless, the work he did with Godzilla, for all the jokes people may make about sweaty Japanese men in rubber suits stepping on toys, it was so good that that's the reason it became the standard technique for kaiju and other works. Before we jump into the film itself, the title. There is much ado about the proper way to pronounce the title of this film. And I'm not here to make a claim about the legitimacy of one over the other. I'm here to make fart jokes about a giant dinosaur. I even went to a place where people in Japan uploaded audio of the pronunciation in Japanese. And even then, there was a divide between them. One said Gojira, and the other said Godzilla. David Callett, a film historian who did the audio commentary on the film, spent several minutes explaining that this is pedantic because ultimately both pronunciations are wrong. They're just wrong in different ways. And he submitted that Godzilla is the proper pronunciation of it. And for my part, I listened carefully over and over to the reporter who was one of the first to say the name in the film. And it does sound like he says Godzilla. The old man says it first, but he sounds like a Japanese Popeye the Sailor Man, so he's unintelligible. Anyway, for reasons of simplicity, I will use the common name of Godzilla in reference to both film and monster. Also, to correct a rumor, Godzilla was indeed chosen by Toho for the English version. It was not a name that was made up by a Western distributor for Godzilla, King of the Monsters. That film was a significant re-edit and introduced Raymond Burr as an American reporter, a role that he would repeat 3 decades later when they did it again, turning Return of Godzilla into Godzilla 1985. Because of this connection, I will, at a later date, be looking at both Godzilla King of the Monsters and Godzilla 1985 to see how both were adapted to America. But now, let's get down to looking at the original Gojira, aka Godzilla.